And Derek, if you could check to make sure that's running okay. It might have a little bit of latency on YouTube.
Yeah, copy. Give me a sec.
All right, we should be all good to go once folks are ready.
Board Member McComb, State Forester Mukamoto, it is now 1 o'clock.
Great, thank you, Hillary. Welcome everybody to the Friday, February 23rd Board of Forestry virtual special meeting. For the record, I'm Brenda McComb, a member of the State Board of Forestry. I was asked by Board Chair Jim Kelly to begin today's meeting while he attends to an unexpected event. Fellow board members, Jim will strive to join us within the hour. Today we are live streaming this event on YouTube and all participants are joining this meeting virtually. To ensure our viewers online can follow along with our proceedings, I'll go over some meeting best practices. Everyone participating, please silence your cell phones and try to limit any background noises. Remember to mute yourself when you are not speaking and disable your video when not presenting or part of the discussion. For the record, we ask all board members and department staff to state their names before speaking, so those listening online can follow the conversation. If you experience online technical difficulties or issues, use the chat function on Zoom to connect with our ODF host during the meeting. For those viewing or participating in this meeting, I'll remind everyone of our general order of operations. There are 5 staff recommendations in front of the board today for decision related to post-disturbance harvest rulemaking. We will begin with the public testimony portion of the meeting and then proceed with our presentation from the department staff. For board members, if you have clarifying questions, please use the raise hand function and I'll call on you. After the presentation, I will open the floor for board discussion where a motion can be presented for vote. I'll do my best to keep us on time and on point during our discussion. Let's move on to roll call to confirm we can meet quorum. Board members, please unmute yourself as I perform this process, and as I call on you, please state your attendance as present by video. Liz Agpoa.
Chair Brenda, I am present by video.
Carla Chambers.
Present by video.
Ben Dimling.
Present by video.
Chandra Ferrari.
Present by video.
Joe Justice.
Present by video.
Jim Kelly. And myself, Brenda McComb, present by video. Now that we've established a quorum is present, and with this being a decision item for the board, I'd like to ask if anyone has a conflict or an appearance of a conflict of interest on this item. If none, let's move on to the first. Oops. Did I hear something?
Since you asked, it's worth noting that I, Ben Doimling, do manage forest land that is beholden to the PFA and Private Forest Practices Act rules. So I'll just note that.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Anyone else?
Yeah, Brenda, this is Joe Justice. I much the same way I manage lands that is impacted by PFA rules. So I'll just declare that.
Great, thank you, Joe.
And Chair, I would also note that I am on a board that manages private lands, private forest lands.
Great, thank you, Carla. Anyone else? Well, thank you for those acknowledgements. I'm assuming that you have now acknowledged those, but also agree that you don't have a conflict which is sufficient to preclude your voting. Is that correct?
That is correct in my case.
Yes.
Yes,
That is correct.
Thank you. So let's move on to the first portion of our meeting. With that, thank you for all of that. Thank you to those who have signed up to provide testimony to the board today. We ask that everyone in the queue not exceed their allotted time of 3 minutes. I ask that before you start, you state your full name and associated affiliation. If representing a group or organization, a timer will be provided to track your time, and each commenter will be called upon to begin. So there will be a timer and you will be called on. Hillary, are we ready to engage with the public comment?
Yes, Board Member McComb, State Forester Mukamoto, and members of the board, we are ready to proceed. All right, everyone in the queue for today's item, you may have noticed that you have a number next to your name, and that is the order that we will move through. I will list names in a set order and then call on each of you to begin your testimony. When you begin, a timer will be displayed 3 minutes. So Yarrow, if you want to share that, that would be great. When you see the timer run out, we ask that you provide your closing statement. As you've known that we are completely in a virtual room, so I'll ask when you're done to please go ahead and disengage your video and mute yourself so we can move on to the next person. But I will line them up first. So I'll announce them all so you're aware of where your order's at. So you're ready to engage. All right, so our order today is first up, Rick Zen, second up, Ken Nugren, Third up is Leanne Vandenberg. Fourth up is Sean Stevens. Fifth is Seth Barnes, and sixth is Rex Storm. So if Rick, if you go ahead and engage your video when you're ready.
Thank you, Hillary.
Mhm.
Rick Zen with the Oregon Small Woodlands Association. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on a beautiful afternoon. Appreciate you coming in. The Oregon Small Woodlands Association and our volunteers have followed this rulemaking process very closely since the 2022 legislative session. The new rule book is 200 pages, single-spaced, and many of us have copies in our cars and trucks, backpacks, shops, and offices. We recommend that the board adopt the recommendations today. I also want to thank Chair Kelly and all the board members who have reached out to our volunteer leadership and members around the state to prepare for implementation of the new rules. I especially want to thank our state forester for coming out on Saturdays for landowner tours at some really exceptional properties and examples of stewardship. Thank you, Cal. I also want to recognize Division Chief Josh Bernard and Deputy Chief Mike Kroon for their leadership with the new SFO programs, as well as the many employees called on in field support, adaptive management, forest health and monitoring who have supported that work. The ODF Committee for Family Forest Lands, CFF, and their public meetings have been extremely valuable, helping us understand the new rules. CFF Chair Wendy Gerlach and Mike Kroon and Heather Henderson have done an exceptional job getting information out and answering questions and addressing concerns in real time. Kudos to fellow board member Ben Doimling for his active engagement with the committee. Thank you, Ben. Good to see you there. We are all still in learning mode. Oregon's forests, as you know, are diverse. And as you know, so is Oregon's forest land community. There will be bumps in the road. We look forward to working with ODF and other agencies to help us with technical support, resources, and when warranted, a well-timed, good job, landowner. That goes a long way. Working together to move forward with all the new rules, like today's session, we can advance forest stewardship on private small forest land properties in Oregon. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Up next, Ken.
Good afternoon, members of the board. My name is Ken Nygren, and I am a small woodland owner in Yamhill County, and I'm also the current past president of OSWA. And I've been intimately involved in the rulemaking and the writing of the legislation, supporting the private forest corridor over the past 4 years. So thank you for allowing me to testify in support of these new salvage harvest rules. As both a small family landowner and a consulting forester working with many small forest landowners, I'm intimately familiar with the delicate task of balancing multiple goals for forest ownership and navigating the daunting set of laws, rules, taxes, and emotions of managing a forest investment. Adding to this mix of ownership challenges is the ever-dynamic forces of nature that impact the forests we love to manage. This new set of rules provides clarity and options for landowners to use to keep our forests safe for our use while sustaining their growth toward a clear vision of providing mature, resilient riparian forests for our communities. OSWA and all small forest landowners are fully committed to making the intent and the spirit of the new forest practice rules work to enhance and sustain our native natural habitat. We believe in supporting our healthy fisheries, riparian dependent wildlife, and providing clean water for our communities. Our diverse membership reflects the totality of opinions on how best to achieve this sustainability of these forests. But as an organization, we seek to inform and find ways within this new paradigm of rules for our members to achieve their ownership goals and dreams. One example of how we reach out to our members and provide them with options for managing their forests in partnership with nature was this message sent out to our last month to our members. Quote, please be aware that the situation of catastrophic events such as our recent ice storm, there is another option available to allow salvage harvesting while maintaining stream protection standards. This option is known as alternative vegetation retention, number 1, catastrophic events. This option allows variation of standard retention widths from the stream cores and may give the SFO significant latitude in recovering damaged trees. The option allows a landowner to reserve the required leave trees using basal area measurement to determine the designated target for reserved trees. With approval of these rules today, OSWA will again send out messages emphasizing the flexibility within the new forest rules for landowners, not only struggling with the emotional.
Can we ask you to finish up, please?
Okay. So not only struggling with the emotional sense of loss and destruction of the forest, but choices available for them to manage their forest. Finally, I want to conclude with a heartfelt gratitude of the PFA authors and ODF to continue to include OSWA as the small landowner voice in developing these rules. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ken. Up next, Leanne Brandenburg. And please make sure to say your name for the record before starting.
Yes. Hi. My name is Leanne Brandenburg, and I'm the project manager with the Klamath Watershed Partnership, the Watershed Council for the Upper Klamath Basin. State Forester Mukamoto and board members, thank you for your time and consideration today. These post-disturbance rule changes as they pertain to streams are predicated on the assumption that the new PFA stream mapping and fish designations are accurate and better than the previous stream database. Evidence that we have for the Klamath Basin proves that is not the case. The new database is fraught with errors in both directions, overprotecting resources that don't exist and underprotecting fish-bearing streams, including miles of bull trout critical habitat. We know these are errors because we have spent the last 6 years and nearly $250,000 of OWEB funding ground truthing streams and conducting physical habitat surveys in key watersheds. Our data collection protocols and collected data were vetted with ODF&W and incorporated into the old database. As a relevant example, there are over 112 miles of bull trout critical habitat in the Bootleg Fire footprint, but the new database labels 40% of those streams as non-fish. That's more than 45 miles incorrectly characterized. At the other end of the spectrum, in Southwest Klamath County, the new database documents more than 400 miles of streams that do not exist in an area just over 200,000 acres. This particular area has large industrial timber ownership and is some of the most productive tree growing ground in the basin. With reference to these rules, a fire in this area would necessitate documentation and justification with ODF and the PFA biologists to remove the miles of non-existent streams from any salvage plans, presenting a tremendous and unnecessary workload on our state employees and industrial partners in an ecologically and economically time-critical situation. This erroneous database is already in use and failing to meet the intent of the PFA while squandering resources. A thorough statewide review by on-the-ground professionals and a better comparison against known data sets is essential to fully understand the nature and extent of the errors. We have met with ODF Salem to show them the issues and still do not yet have a firm timeline on when the known errors in the Klamath Basin will be fixed. So any corrections on a statewide level, if needed, would likely be an insurmountable task within the current PFA timelines, and it cannot be a piecemeal effort. In the context of this post-disturbance harvest rulemaking, Pushing forward more stringent regulations without fixing the underlying database first is illogical. It will unnecessarily overburden ODF and forest landowners without adequately protecting fish. The legacy of these database errors will continue to ripple through the PFA process, compromising the FRIA process and jeopardizing the goals of the HCP and associated incidental take permit for private forest lands in Oregon. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, Sean Stevens.
Hello, Member McComb, members of the board. My name is Sean Stevens. I'm the Executive Director of Oregon Wild, and I've been involved in the private forest accord process and negotiations since their inception. And I am here to speak in favor of the staff recommendation to the board to make a degradation finding related to the existing post-disturbance logging rules and to move forward with rulemaking. And I want to acknowledge, and Leanne just brought this up, but that the process of the private forest accord has not always been perfect, and it's strained both the staff capacity and the board's comfort level at times. But I do think once again today, it's important to note that the conservation community and the industry, as well as the Oregon Small Woodlands Association, are all in agreement with all of us supporting the recommendations of staff. And I think it is worth noting that this is still a big deal, and continuing the momentum of the PFA is really important. For background, the post-disturbance rulemaking process was directed by the legislature in SB 1501, and that bill required the agency and the board to finalize rulemaking by November 30th, 2025. So we're way ahead of schedule. The board also recognized back in adopting the private forest accord rules in October 2022 that there was a need to update these particular post-disturbance rules, knowing that they were now going to be out of step with the riparian management area, no harvest zones, the slope retention area set-asides, and the newly buffered designated debris flow torrents, and more. The timeline for drafting and submitting the PFA Habitat Conservation Plan has driven an accelerated timeline for the literature review related to these rules. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank the ODF team for working under such tight timelines. And it's not the first time that they've had to as part of the PFA. These tight timelines have caused some stress and consternation among many parties. SB 1501 directed rulemaking for post-disturbance harvest of trees that, but for the disturbance, would not be harvested under the new rules. The private forest accord report charged the board to commission a review of literature and other evidence to consider whether the current rules and practices related to post-disturbance harvests are sufficient to meet the goals of the PFA. I think perhaps driven by the truncated timeline, the literature review is not as expansive as directed by SB 1501 and the PFA report. And the Conservation Coalition found that many of the studies that were relevant to analyzing this important question were not included, and some study findings were misconstrued in the review. Still, the sum total of the degradation finding is accurate and necessary. With the new no harvest areas in the RMAs, SRAs, and DDFTAs, ensuring protection for these important landscape features in a post-disturbance environment is paramount for achieving the goals of the PFA and the upcoming HCP. And the degradation finding and subsequent rulemaking will allow these post-disturbance rules to be included in the HCP so that the activities can be part of the covered activities in the incidental take permit. Wrapping up, the new rules are really important in part because it takes the post-disturbance logging rules out of the nebulous realm of the plans for alternate practices and gives everyone a solid expectation, operators, ODF staff, and the public to know what to expect in a post-disturbance landscape. I'd like to thank the opportunity to comment today, urge the board to approve the degradation finding and move forward with rulemaking. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Up next, Seth.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. And I'm just going to kind of echo, appreciate Sean's comments. And good morning, Chair McComb, State Forester Mukamoto, members of the board. For the record, my name is Seth Barnes, and I'm the Director of Forest Policy at the Oregon Forest Industries Council. Thanks for the opportunity to address you this afternoon regarding post-disturbance harvest rules. I'm going to start my remarks today kind of where Sean left off by stating for the record that OFIC understands the compressed timeline for this rulemaking and the resulting less than optimal literature review that will be presented to you today.
While we understand this necessity, we're also confident that this rapid review did not fully capture all of the science. That said, we support the effort that the department has made and support the board moving this forward in the spirit of the Private Forest Accord and taking the necessary steps towards adopting these draft rules. OFIC supports the draft rules that are before you today. These past few years have been remarkable for many reasons, and for those of us who are on the front lines of the Private Forest Accord, it has been a time that we will always remember as a major inflection or milestone along the path of our careers. I've been one of the people representing working forests in the post-disturbance harvest discussions and can attest to the spirit of the PFA being alive and well. In a world dominated by my way or the highway politics, I'm humbled to be a part of something very different here in Oregon. The fact is, every human being has their respective view of the world informed by their personal experiences. Finding compromise and agreement is uncomfortable. Any facilitator working in a space like this will tell you to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I have a better understanding of what that means now. It requires that passions and egos be held in check and individuals truly work to see the world from a different perspective. So to that end, we support the actions laid out before you in the staff report and urge the board to support the draft rules. Thanks.
Thank you. Up last is Rex Storm.
Good afternoon, Chair McComb, State Forester Mukamoto, and board members. My name is Rex Storm, and I'm with Associated Oregon Loggers based in Salem. I serve as Executive Vice President and am a certified forester. My trade association provides voice and business services to nearly 1,000 small family businesses who work across Oregon's forests to contract, manage, grow, construct, thin, restore, protect, harvest, burn, and transport materials from forest to market. I'm here today to talk about the salvage topic in worker safety. The PFA report, Post-Disturbance Harvest Rulemaking, endeavors. In that endeavor, it requires us to consider worker safety. A key AOL pillar is safe work by member businesses and employers. We aim to advance safe work for forest operators through proactive forest policy, education, and consultation. AOL member businesses are the most experienced professionals knowledgeable of forest operational dangers. These businesses have gained generations of experience with forest hazards, including those extraordinary hazards and dangers of operating in burnt forest lands. When the skilled forest workers work near or under scorched and decayed trees, struck by hazards are high. Safe work near burned trees requires the utmost of professional expertise to navigate the many possible hazards that must be assessed by that professional worker. The hazards are extreme and can be fatal if those specific dangers of every tree are not properly identified and safely mitigated by each skilled worker on the job site. Work in burnt forest adds exceptional hazards that are best defined and mitigated by the competent person. The competent person is the forest worker and their forest employer. A danger tree is identified by Oregon OSHA, Oregon Administrative Rule Division 7, forest activities as a standing tree, alive or dead, that presents a hazard to personnel due to deterioration or physical damage, etc. Division 7, specifically working near unstable objects and danger trees, states that on a daily basis, a competent person, I'll emphasize, a competent person must evaluate any danger tree or snag within the reach of the work area to determine if it poses a hazard to personnel. Work in burnt forest adds exceptional hazards that are best defined and determined by that competent person who is the forest worker and their employer. The safe duty of the competent person cannot be replaced or subjugated by the landowner or some third-party agency. Moreover, AOL supports the appropriate level of flexibility and deference that is within the proposed salvage rules about competent person. So
Thank
this
you, Rex.
acknowledgement recognizes that each tree, each circumstance is different and must be considered by the competent person. So I really appreciate your listening to me today.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much to all the testimony providers. We do appreciate you being here virtually online. Board Member McComb, State Forester Mukomoto, and members of the board, this concludes our public testimony portion of the meeting.
Thank you, Hillary. And those who participated, thank you for your comments. I just want to check in with board members to see if there are any comments from board members at this point. Seeing none. Josh Barnard, are you and your staff ready to begin the second portion of this special meeting?
Yes, board member. Brenda, could I just make a quick comment? I'm sorry. I was trying to get my hand
yes,
up.
Joe. Yes.
Apologize. Trying to find where do I hit the reactions there. I do want to echo, Leanne Brandenburg's issue regarding, accuracy of the mapping, and that is implementation of the PFA. That is a concern that I know we're dealing with here in Eastern Oregon. I know our lands on the west side are dealing with very much the same thing, and that is a big deal. There's a lot of time, effort, manpower being put into this, and because we don't, the modeled outcomes of these maps are not accurate. So I would just kind of echo that concern. That's really happening across the landscape, and landowners are struggling with that right now. So I mean, my hope is the sooner we can get accurate maps in the hands of landowners, the better, because that issue. That's my only comment, Brenda. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. I was just made aware of that as well, and it does seem very concerning. Carla.
Thank you, Brenda. Yeah, I had just a comment regarding the mapping as well and how we really address that concern going forward. And maybe Josh can, talk about that in his comments. The other thing is when we were in Wallowa, Mike Shaw made some really, clear comments as we were out on that site visit with regard to firefighter safety as well. So I really appreciated Rex Storm's comments on worker safety, because I think those of us that, work with the workers' comp system, this is the highest risk category, I believe, in Oregon's worker comp system. And so I really appreciate his comments, but I'd also, if Mike's on this call today, maybe remind everybody of what he had to say with regard to the fighting safety as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. Any other comments from board members? All right, Josh, seeing none, we'll turn it over to you.
All right, great. Thanks, Brenda. All right. Good afternoon, Board Member McComb, members of the board, State Forester Mukomoto. I'm Josh Bernard, Forest Resources Division Chief. And maybe I'll take a second as we're pulling up the presentation here just to respond a little bit to the couple comments that Joe had and some of the public testimony. Specific to the Klamath Flake piece, we've made that one of our top priorities at the moment for some of our GIS staff in terms of responding to that and working through the existing data there for some of the ground truth information. And we'll be working with ODF&W as well. A lot of our processes now are a dual agency process in terms of managing that data and making sure we're incorporating the correct stream data. So as we learn about those, we're turning our attention to those and working as quickly as we can to address any of those discrepancies that pop up. So. All right. I'll start with the presentation here. So again, good afternoon. For the record, Josh Bernard, Forest Resources Division Chief. The purpose of this agenda item is to request the Board of Forestry make determinations required by statute and direct the department to take specific actions related to rulemaking on post-disturbance harvest as directed by Senate Bill 1501. Key staff members from the division and I are here to give you an overview of the authorities guiding this rulemaking, a literature review of evidence related to the current post-disturbance rule, a draft set of rules, and staff recommendations. We will pause for questions after the authorities and literature review before we move on to the draft rules and staff recommendations. As a brief reminder, in February 2020, conservation and forest industry groups offered to revise the Forest Practices Act and administrative rules through a memorandum of understanding to include mediated discussions known as the Private Forest Accord. In June 2020, the legislature adopted Senate Bill 1602, which increased helicopter spray buffers, directed rulemaking for salmon, steelhead, and bull trout streams in the Siskiyou region, and set communication laws for spraying pesticides by helicopter. The bill set the accord timeline and topics for making changes to the Forest Practices Act and rules to support an application for a programmatic habitat conservation plan, or HCP. In March 2022, the legislature adopted the accord recommendations through Senate Bills 1501 and 1502 and House Bill 4055. Senate Bill 1501 modified existing Forest Practices Act statutes, directed rulemaking, and incorporated by reference the Private Forest Accord report. The Private Forest Accord report further detailed the recommended changes to be made to the Forest Practices Act rules. For today, Senate Bill 1501, Section 6 states that pursuant to the authority granted by ORS 527710, and subject to the procedures set forth in ORS 527714, the Board of Forestry shall initiate rulemaking concerning the post-disturbance harvest of trees that, but for the disturbance, would not be harvested under rules adopted, amended, or repealed as part of the rule package described in Section 2 of that 2022 Act. And Section 2 is referring to the initial rulemaking package that was adopted in the fall of 2022.
Excuse me, Josh. I'm not sure if you want a PowerPoint showing now, but it is not on my end.
Yes, sorry, Brenda. We're fixing that right now.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt, Josh.
No worries, perfect timing. So now I'll turn it over to Nicole Stapp to cover the statutory requirements in addition to Senate Bill 1501 that apply to this rulemaking.
Nicole, if you could just let me know what slide we're on.
Hi, Yarrow, the second slide would be perfect. This one would be great. All right. Good afternoon, Board Member McComb, members of the board, and State Forest Member Mokomoto. For the record, I'm Nicole Stapp, Policy Advisor for the Forest Resources Division. So we're going to start the presentation today with an overview of the board's rulemaking authority related to forest practices, and then the rulemaking processes that apply to forest practice rules. Oregon Revised Statute 527710 is the state law that grants the board rulemaking authority related to regulating forest practices rules. And then rules adopted under this authority are to administer the Forest Practices Act and are then known as Forest Practices Rules. And these authorities are really closely tied to the duties of the board and are adopted for three different purposes. Those purposes are to ensure the continuous growing and harvesting of forestry species, and provide for the overall maintenance of air quality, water resources, soil productivity, and fish and wildlife, to protect specific species and resource sites, or to reduce the risk of serious injury or death by landslides. As Josh mentioned, the post-disturbance harvest rulemaking falls under the ORS 527-710-2 statutory authority. And now that we've kind of covered what authority the board has to do rulemaking, talk just a tiny bit about the rulemaking process itself. And so all the rules that are adopted by the board are subject to the Administrative Procedures Act, which is also known as the APA process. The APA process is the typical state agency rulemaking process, which is captured in state law. And this process really involves filing rulemaking actions with the Secretary of State's office. And the APA process also requires a number of required notifications be filed. Most of those are really centered around providing notice to either legislative members or committees within specific timelines. Additionally, boards, commissions, and state agencies adopt rules that govern rulemaking, and the board's adopted rules on rules prescribe specific notice requirements. For example, they require that specific, we're still on the other slide. Thank you. They require that specific publications and organizations and entities, for example, members of regional forest practice committees, get notifications of rulemaking. And they also require that rules be adopted using the DOJ model rules to be followed. Additionally, ORS 527.710 itself, again, the law that gives the board rulemaking authority, requires that the board consult with other government entities that are affected by forest operations before forest practice rules are adopted. All these different rulemaking frameworks actually layer on top of each other to create the rulemaking process that must be followed when adopting forest practice rules. And in some cases, this rulemaking framework is even further expanded by a statute that is ORS 527.714, which we're going to cover in a little bit more detail. So if we can move to the next slide, please. All right, so ORS 527.714 is a unique rulemaking procedure that applies to forest practice rules. And it establishes the additional processes that the board must follow when considering adopting forest practice rules. This statute describes forest practice rules as generally consisting of 3 different types of rules, which are summarized on this slide. Type 1A rules are rules that implement administration or procedures, do not directly regulate forest practices. So examples of these types of rules would include rules related to how committees are going to operate, how rulemaking might be handled, or even things like how public records requests will be handled. Type 1B rules would provide either definitions or procedures for forest practices where those standards or requirements are already set in statute. So an example would be if the board was to adopt forest practices rules that mirror what's already in legislation or in state law. And then type 1C rules are rules that regulate forest practices where the board has broad discretion to set what those standards are and what that will look like. And then before the APA notice, so again, that's typical rulemaking process that state agencies follow. Before the APA notice of proposed rulemaking can be filed, the board must determine which type of forest practice rule is being considered. So whether it's a type 1A, 1B, or 1C rule that's being considered. And then if the board was to determine that a proposed rule is a type 1C rule, and it changes forest practice standards, there are additional requirements that will apply to the rulemaking process. So additional steps that will have to be completed. And those steps is that the rule will then have to describe its purpose and the level of protection that's desired. And then before the APA public comment period on that rule closes, the board, there's an economic analysis that's required that has to be made available to the public. And then finally, before the board can actually adopt that rule, they have to determine that specific facts and standards are met. Those facts and standards do vary a little bit depending on which authority the board is adopting the rule under. For example, for landslide type rules, there's very specific things that are required, or resource site rules, there's additional specific requirements that apply. And so related to post-disturbance harvest rules, the department got started, as we were directed to in January 2023, to prepare the board for this process. And one of the ways that we did that was by conducting the literature review. That literature review is in the board materials as attachment number 2. And Kate Thompson, our monitoring coordinator, is going to provide an overview of that literature review. So I will pass it over to her and we'll move on to the next slide.
Good afternoon, Board Member McComb, members of the board, State Forester Mukomoto. For the record, my name is Kate Thompson. I'm the monitoring coordinator for the Forest Resources Division. Today, I will be presenting findings of the post-disturbance harvest literature review. First, a little bit about how we went about this. This was a rapid review, which is a condensed version of a systematic evidence review. So the goal was to keep the key elements of a systematic evidence review and maintain rigor while reducing elements that would prevent timely completion of the project. So we had statutory deadlines that we had to meet for rulemaking, and also we're hoping to include any post-disturbance harvest rules should they be changed in the habitat conservation plan. So we started by developing a protocol that guided our work. including developing search strings in consultation with the State Library of Oregon, developing a priori article selection criteria, for example, that study areas needed to be ecologically similar to Oregon, either east, west, or both. The study had to take place after a disturbance and so forth. We conducted an article search that resulted in over 2,200 articles using these search strings and applied those selection criteria to each article. In the end, we ended up with 47 publications that met all of the criteria and were selected for inclusion in this review. These included peer-reviewed articles, technical reports, and what is known as gray literature, which would be your technical reports and similar. We synthesized those findings as they relate to OAR 629-643-0300 goals, which are stream shade, providing stream shade, large wood, bank stability, and quick and healthy stand development, and related that synthesis to ORS 527-710 sub 2, which states that rules shall provide for the overall maintenance of air quality, water resources, soil productivity, and fish and wildlife. As part of this project, we consulted with well over 80 people, including subject matter experts at universities and the U.S. Forest Service and Geological Survey, ODFW, DEQ, and a late draft was reviewed by PFA authors, whose feedback we incorporated into the version that you see in the board packet. Next slide, please. With respect to stream shade, and these are fairly high level as far as the description of the findings, but we found that live trees provide the most shade, followed by dead trees, which provide about half as much stream shade, and then no trees at all provided the least. In the short term, hardwoods provide better shade than conifers simply because they grow faster. Water temperature impacts depend on more than stream shade, though. While live and dead tree presence is important after a disturbance, so are the stream flow level in a particular stream reach and whether a stream interacts with groundwater. So spring-fed streams are going to be cooler, for example, than streams that are not. Next slide, please. With respect to large wood and bank stability, whether to remove or retain large wood depends on pre-disturbance conditions. Was the stand healthy? What did things look like beforehand? The type of disturbance. So, for example, a high severity fire burns up the wood and debris flows put wood in. You know, something really massive like Mount St. Helens radically changes the entire landscape. So in some cases, in these Mount St. Helens level situations, it can impair riparian and aquatic functions, but those are kind of edge cases. Riparian buffers during salvage mitigate effects on bank stability. We used recent studies in this review where buffers are in common use as a best management practice. In the articles we did review, there was no consensus on what was an appropriate buffer width, but the narrowest that was found to maintain function was about 30 feet. And buffer widths varied by both the site and the disturbance type and severity. In any case, healthy riparian stands were found to regenerate on their own, and quick sprouting after a disturbance begins to stabilize banks about 2 to 5 years after a disturbance. Next slide, please. With respect to stand regeneration, we found that stand regeneration outcomes are dependent on pre-disturbance conditions. So again, this healthy stand, whether or not the stand was healthy prior to the disturbance, and also the type and the severity of the disturbance. No touch zones by streams decrease the likelihood of both post-disturbance harvest and replanting in those zones. And we did also find that unmanaged riparian stands tend to be hardwood dominated, but that this is site specific. Next slide, please. So applying this to current rule is intended to achieve long-term goals, these desired future conditions. So we're looking 80 to 200 years out. But we found that there was a key time frame to protect streams, and that was about 2 to 5 years after a disturbance, protecting both upslope sediment delivery to streams, both from salvage and from the disturbance itself. This is especially the case in in the case of high severity fire, that quick shade development, bank stability, and large wood sprouting and hardwoods all contributed to that. So that 2 to 5 year window is where we can help stabilize things and provide greater protection to streams. So increased retention near streams also increases benefits to stream shade, to large wood delivery, to bank stability. Something to note is that current rule has a 10 to 20 foot no cut zone depending on the stream size and type. And the literature suggests that a larger tree retention area provides greater protection from salvage related impacts, especially upslope sediment delivery to streams after fire. Next slide, please.
Great. Thank you, Kate. And for the record, Josh Bernard, Forest Resources Division Chief again. We've covered a lot of material and would like to pause and see if the board has questions before we transition into the draft rules and the staff recommendations.
Thank you, Josh. Any questions from board members? I have several, but I will wait for others. Liz.
I'm just, Kate, when you went through, oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Loud and clear.
Kate, when you went through your quick literature review, your rapid review that you called it, and you were looking at 2,000 articles and went down to the 47, you had some parameters that these this material documents studies needed to be similar to Oregon, either east or west side or both. Do you feel, even though the review was a rapid review in the 47 publications and these articles, do you feel that you captured a good portion of what was out there, given that we're looking at this locale that is Oregon? Or did you feel that perhaps there was still a lot out there to look at? Just kind of curious.
I think there's always more out there to look at. One of the challenges that we have working with the State Library of Oregon is that our access to science databases aren't as excellent as they might be. They're good, but they're not as good as they could be. And we tried to augment that by using Google Scholar, Tree Search, and we also use the U.S. Forest Service library in order to try to expand our search and capture more articles. But we did not have access to Web of Science or some of the more expansive. We did reach out to experts at various agencies, both at the state and federal levels, and received additional literature from them, the pieces that they thought were important to the study. And so as those met the criteria, some of them were general overviews, and we did not include review articles because then we're reviewing what somebody else thought an article said. So we stuck with original sources. So I think in the amount of time we had and with the resources we had, that we were as thorough as we could be.
All right, thank you.
Other questions from board members? Well, while you're pondering that, I will ask a few. Kate, most of the questions I have revolve around the literature review, and I just want to refer back to the Rulemaking Authority, the ORS laws. And all of them refer to, well, the first two refer to maintenance of fish and wildlife species. But
Yeah,
yet there was no review of habitat requirements for fish and wildlife species that use either the stream or the streamside area or would be benefited by current or future rules. Why?
That is a great question. We started out with about 200 pages of synthesis that we boiled down and boiled down and boiled down. And so as we continued boiling and our recipe reduced, it's not that there weren't articles. There were a few. We had several. We had one on the coastal-tailed frog, and we had a couple on salmonids. I think that because we our timeline was short, and then it was shortened, that in the rewrites that we inadvertently wrote those out. And so I can speak to that now if you would like.
Well, maybe just to step back for a second. Are you familiar with the decade body of literature that was pulled together by the Forest Service?
I am not.
Yeah, so there are hundreds of citations of scientific literature that relate wildlife to forest conditions, including post-disturbance conditions. And that was not included here. And it's a publicly available database that is really open to anyone. So that really raised a red flag for me that each species has its own habitat requirements, but that wasn't addressed here. So I think it is a shortcoming. But go ahead, please, if you have further comments.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for that feedback. I appreciate it. The literature that we did review related to wildlife coincided with, and I also am helping Jennifer Weichel with the habitat conservation, but coincide with what I've learned about habitat requirements for the covered species in terms of having, basically, cool, clear, clean, connected, complex water sources for species, and how those developed over time after a disturbance. We didn't find in our searches any that were directly related to salvage, however. So we can speak generally to species needs, but we can't really speak in the literature that we found about how salvage might affect that, other than extrapolating that, that we're dealing with increases in turbidity, that we were dealing, that we had concerns about turbidity. We had concerns about, loss of large wood, whether through salvage or through the disturbance itself. That and most of those issues were occurring, with the exception of large wood, obviously, because that takes time to develop, with both impacts from the disturbance, especially with high severity fire, and with salvage itself and upslope sediment delivery to streams that can occur from salvage activities.
Yeah, thank you. Though I would suggest that there are a lot of species besides those that live in the water, amphibians in particular, move out into terrestrial environments, and as well as some other wildlife species that are not currently listed, that should be considered in this rulemaking, and are not.
If I may, we did have some work about the coastal-tailed frog, but it was largely related to Mount St. Helens and kind of genetic drift, and whether frogs were moving outside of the areas in which they had originally been found over time.
Okay. Thanks.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No,
sorry to interrupt.
No worries. No, go ahead.
Yeah, the other concern I had with the literature search was streamside trees and trees adjacent to the riparian area. And if you have a mature Douglas fir stand in the Coast Range of Oregon, say 50 years of age, maybe rotation age, and those trees are killed by a fire or a windstorm, those trees are probably, I'm going to ask Joe and Ben to correct me here if I get it wrong, but 150 feet tall. So when those blow over, they can contribute dead wood to that stream. Or if they fall through decay processes, they contribute dead wood to that stream. And I didn't see that addressed in the literature review, that dead wood delivery to streams is really dependent upon the size of the trees in the adjacent areas, and also slope conditions, tree growth rates, a variety of things that really influence the complexity of that stream corridor as a function of having dead wood in it.
Yeah, I would agree that is not, we tried to, well, we didn't even try to, we stuck with the literature that we found. And so we knew that there were areas we were hoping, I'm going to back up a second. We were hoping to augment the search that we did do with a manual search, which is part of the full systematic evidence review process. But due to changes in the timeline, we were not able to complete that step in the process. And so we did have to work what we have. There was a little bit of that work present in the literature we reviewed, but it did not make it to the final draft. I believe it was only a couple of articles, but I'm working off the top of my head though, so I'd have to go take a look to be sure.
All right, thank you, Kate. I see Jim Kelly has joined us. So Jim, I'm going to pass the baton to you, but we're just asking board members for questions and comments at this point. And it looks like Joe has one.
Great, thank you. Looks like you've been doing a great job, Brenda. Appreciate it. Let the record show, I think I joined about 1:45. And so I'll take over. Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and welcome. Speaking about, Brenda brought up the subject of timber and large wood access to riparian areas. I mean, did the literature review the likelihood of large wood reaching riparian areas or contributing to downwood because of distance from streams? I know there's from literature on the likelihood, the farther away a tree is from the actual stream course itself, the less likely it will contribute to downwood.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I'm trying to make sure I understand it.
I know there's quite a bit of, there's been research about the likelihood of the contribution of downwood as you move farther away from the stream. There's less likelihood that tree will actually contribute to downwood. It's just there's been reason. I know there's studies in regard to that. A tree 10 feet away from a stream is much more likely to become downwood than a tree, say 80 feet away from a stream. It was that part of this literature review. Was that
yes,
analysis?
I think that expands on the question that board member McComb just asked, and that's one of the, we did have a couple of studies that did address that, including one that was on the Tillamook State Forest that looked at different areas and how site specific that these kinds of changes were, that it depended on what was the slope nearby and what were the conditions and what kind of trees were present and that sort of thing. And so that's one of the things that we found with hardwoods in particular. They're fast growing, they're close to the stream, but they also don't live as long as conifers, and so they come down sooner. And so they're kind of part of the equation as far as that goes. But is that what you were asking?
Yeah, in a sort of way. I just happen to know. I mean, there's been research about downwood contribution. How likely is a tree to contribute to downwood? To actually reach the stream and have a contribution. And I know that's dictated on distance. I mean, distance is a piece of that equation. I know.
Yeah, that is something that we didn't get into the weeds on because we were approaching this rather broadly in terms of literature synthesis, but there was some literature present. We really didn't have, it's a really extensive body of literature, and within our search criteria, in order to capture that, and this type of review lends itself more towards the 10,000 foot view than the micro view. And so we were trying to capture so many things in such a short period of time that that if we'd gotten into the weeds, we would have given you all several hundred pages to digest, and and that would have involved a lot more time and capacity than we had, unfortunately.
No, Kate, I completely understand. I understand. I just wanted to point that out. Yeah.
Thank you. Brenda, you have your hand up.
You're muted, Brenda.
Thank you, Joe. I wanted to respond to your question, Joe. That is that there is a classic paper by Van Sickle and Gregory that addresses exactly that in the Cascades with Douglas fir. And in fact, adjacent slope adjacent to the streams, tree species, and tree size all contribute to that loading. And so I think I just want to maybe not focus on that so much, but simply focus on the fact that there is a lot of literature out there that does relate directly to how these rules should be made.
Okay, Chandra, you've got, that sounded like that was not a question. So Chandra, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to follow up and make sure that I understand the process a little bit. Thank you, Kate. And I saw the synthesis or the criteria that all of the literature was funneled through. And it sounds like you did a big scope to a lot of individuals that are very knowledgeable about this area to get relevant literature. And, I guess I'm wondering, is anything that folks that you were soliciting information from, or were there papers that they said this is really important, but it didn't end up making it through because you all, because I'm assuming it was ODF staff that went through the synthesis factors and you said, no, it doesn't work here, but some of your partners were saying this is important information that should be in here. I guess I'm just wondering if there's any dialogue like that back and forth between partners recognizing the short time frame, but given that you were soliciting information from such a large amount of folk.
We had some great conversations, particularly with the Pacific Northwest Research Station staff, who were just outstanding in terms of the conversations we had. And one of the challenges, as far as the specificity of what we were doing, is that if we were able to kind of cast a broader net and take it all the way up to the ridgeline and do those sorts of things, as opposed to, we were focusing on a rule. And the rule is about vegetation retention near streams. And so that's really where we made our focus in order to approach that rule. And there is, according also to the Pacific Northwest Research Station staff, not as much literature out there as they would like to see. As a matter of fact, one of the questions that I addressed with one of their scientists, he says, this is something I want to study because we don't know anything about it really. So while, we could, if given an enormous amount of time and the ability to add that manual search in order, I'm sure that we would have found quite a bit more that contributed to the conversation. But as far as literature that nobody was insistent that we include anything. As a matter of fact, much of what we received were review articles, which was something that we decided to exclude so that we weren't interpreting somebody else's interpretation of the literature.
Okay. And then just one more quick question. I think it may have been Sean that mentioned this in his testimony. It sounded like the authors had a chance to review the actual report at some point, and there was something about maybe them quibbling with the characterization of some of the findings or something like that. But I thought I heard you say that the feedback that you got was incorporated into the final.
That's correct. We received feedback from both the conservation and working forest coalitions and addressed all of their substantive comments, including, anything where it was determined that there might be a difference in interpretation of articles or, a key point that we'd missed or anything like that. And we worked that in prior to what you were provided in the board packet.
Yep. Thank you.
Any other questions for staff from board members? Not hearing any, we'll move on. I want to thank Josh and his staff for your team's hard work on this and for this information and for the recommendation to the board. I'd like to offer the opportunity if any board members have further comments and anything else you'd like to bring up before we get to the point of someone presenting a motion.
Oh, reaction.
Yes, I see you.
Thank you. I couldn't get my hand up soon enough. Thank you, Chair Kelly. I just, not a question or anything, but I just want to acknowledge and thank the very transparent process that it seems to have been this from the very beginning, with all parties involved and the staff, and just recognizing the time frame that y'all were working on and the amount of work that has been put in and dedication from all parties, from what we heard in the early public comments. I find that inspiring. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Brenda, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Jim. Couple of quick comments. First of all, positive comments initially. First, I appreciate the collaboration work done between industry, environmental groups, ODF, finding agreement around use of the best available science to craft rules and move forward, I think is really admirable. And secondly, I am absolutely convinced that salvage logging is possible while still conserving habitat for a wide variety of species and ecological functions. But this isn't it. And I have several concerns, and it will cause me to not support the proposed rules. One is that the habitat needs for species is completely overlooked. The contribution of dead wood to streams from upslope areas is completely overlooked. We had a concern raised that Josh addressed regarding the errors in the stream layer in GIS, which makes implementation of these rules problematic and really does erode the confidence that I have that this is going to be carried out correctly. And then finally, my last concern is the fact that we're being asked to approve a set of rules, proposed rules, and a degradation finding given to us without our involvement in any of it. I'm not one who's likely to rubber stamp something that's handed to me that I had really not a full understanding of. So I'm just going to leave it at that. But when we do come to a vote, the way I vote is partially explained by what I just described.
Okay, Ben.
Thank you, Chair. Ben Dormling for the record. I might echo some of what Brenda said and expand on some other thoughts I have on this. It's with a lot of reluctance that I find myself probably supporting this rule, and for a couple specific reasons. And reason number one is, Brenda alluded to this, but this process of post PFA being passed through the legislature, this is one of those sort of leftover pieces that was not solved by the authors, and it's continuing to be solved by the authors, and we are continuing to be asked to approve this, and it troubles me, and I struggle to approve something that the board didn't really have a hand in writing. And I am generally supportive of the PFA. I think it's a phenomenal example of collaboration here in Oregon. And I want to see this through, but this is not a good process. The board needs a lot more ownership in this work. And for me to continue to be supportive of this, we need to see that change. And I feel like the literature review has been a punching bag today in this meeting, and I just want to have a huge thank you to Kate for the hard work that you did on that in the very short time that you had. It was incomplete. It had its shortcomings. We've talked about that, but at the same time, it was required, and I think it was important. And it's important to know what the literature, what the science tells us about these proposed rules. And I struggled to draw a line between the literature review and the rule that is proposed. And blaming the literature review and that process for not aligning with the rule that has been chosen is frustrating. I've talked to a lot of people about this, trying to understand and educate myself on these rules, and having a reduced buffer I haven't quite seen the scientific justification for that yet, of how that is going to help us get the desired future conditions faster. So I hope that future rulemaking around PFA and forest practices rules in general can have a lot more ownership from the board. And we can take the time that we need to do this work right.
Thank you. Joe Justice.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. First of all, I just want to really thank the authors, and Seth and Sean and Stacy and everybody that's involved in moving this ball down the road. And so thank you very much for the hard. This is a lot of hard work to kind of get this across the finish line. I also want to point out, the work that we do is imperfect, and I think we have to recognize that. The policy work is somewhat imperfect, but I really, this is such a win. This is such a good news story for working together as Oregonians to find solutions. And so I just want to say that. And Mr. Chair, is Josh going to bring something for? Is there another presentation, or are we ready for a motion, or where are we at?
We're at the point of just trying to finish, make sure that everybody's had a chance to make comments, and then I will ask for a motion. And if needed, I have in front of me a wording for a motion that I can read out to all of you. Okay. Josh, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, for the record, Josh Bernard. Jim, we do have one or two more slides we could walk through just to put the recommendation on there and make sure everybody's captured the actual rule language, if that would be helpful at this point.
Josh, that would be great. I think, why don't you go ahead and do that?
Great, thank you. At this point, I'll ask Nicole to walk through those couple of components here.
All right, is my audio back on? Okay, I'm gonna hope so.
The slides are on, but it just says questions. It's not referring to the, yeah.
All right, next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so now we were going to preview for you the draft rules. And these are attachment 1 in the board materials today. So if you'd like to pull up the full document for yourself, you can. Otherwise, we'll cover the high-level details by way of the slide deck. And so within the post-disturbance harvest rules, there are 2 different rules that have proposed amendments to them. The first one is Oregon Administrative Rule 629-643-000, which is the vegetation retention goals. And this rule really sets the purpose of the full Division 643 rules, which are water protection rules, vegetation along streams. And this rule division is commonly thought of as the riparian management area rules. The proposed changes in this rule section in your attachment are presented as track changes. And the changes to this rule are really limited to technical corrections. These include deleting a reference to this rulemaking effort, subsequent renumbering, deleting a reference to tables that are proposed to be deleted in the proposed 629-643-0300 rule, and then also a small correction for accuracy. The second rule in the draft rules is OAR 629-643-0300. This rule is the alternative vegetation retention prescription, which is a prescription that can be applied in lieu of the standard practice or a small forest landowner minimum option, if that's applicable. And then, of course, if those conditions that are in there are met. The proposed rule would replace that existing rule, and it includes elements that apply statewide, and then there are other elements of it that are region-specific. So first, we're going to cover the provisions that apply statewide. The first is the purpose statement that's established in the rule. The next is the definition of stand level mortality, and the draft rule defines it stand level mortality as riparian management area, or an RMA, or harvest unit with 50% or more dying or recently dead trees due to a catastrophic event, and it also provides examples of catastrophic events. Statewide, it would exempt small forest landowner harvest units that are experiencing stand level mortality from the watershed cap, which this would effectively enable them to use the SFO minimum option, even if it would otherwise be unavailable to them. And then it also clarifies that all forest practices rules apply unless explicitly stated. So next we'll cover the region-specific provisions. So if we can move to the next slide, please. All right, so in addition to the statewide elements and the proposed provisions for Western and Eastern Oregon. And I just want to share a reminder that in the forest practices rules, West and East is divided by the Cascade Crest, which is a little bit different than we typically think about Western and Eastern Oregon, but just want to make that clarification. But in the draft rules in Western Oregon, it would allow for type SSBT and type F stream RMAs with stand level mortality. It allows the harvest of dying or recently dead trees outside the first 75 feet of the RMA. And it also sets protections for the RMA with provisions around soil disturbance, which include an equipment limitation zone, or an ELZ, and requiring corrective actions if there's a certain threshold of disturbance. It also places restrictions on the application of chemicals, and then it allows a less dense reforestation standard within that area. For type NP stream RMAs with stand level mortality, it allows the harvest of dying or recently dead trees in the RMA, and then it requires an RELZ be applied. An RELZ is basically an ELZ, so an equipment limitation zone with some vegetation retention requirements. And then the last provision in Western Oregon is that for harvest units with stand level mortality, it allows the harvest of dying or recently dead trees in slope retention areas. And then it does set some conditions in when one of those SRAs or slope retention areas has to be left unharvested. In Eastern Oregon, the draft rule allows operators for terminal type NP RMAs with stand level mortality to harvest dying or recently dead trees in the outer zone of that RMA. So that is kind of the high level overview of what it's proposed within the draft post-disturbance harvest rules. And then next slide, please. The remainder of this presentation really focuses on the determinations that are required by ORS 527-714. That's that additional rulemaking process that applies to forest practice rules. And then the 5 staff recommendations that are being brought to the board for a decision today. All of these staff recommendations are contained within today's staff report, which you can, of course, refer to at any time during the conversation. But we've also put each staff recommendation on the slide just so that it's a little bit easier to reference. And so when considering the forest practice rules, the first determination that the board must make is to determine which type of rule is being considered. The 3 types of rules, we've, of course, previously covered them, but they're also listed on the slide for easy reference. And then as we talked about, if the board determines that a rule is a type 1C rule and that the proposed changes actually change the standards for forest practices, additional requirements will apply. Those additional requirements are what's tackled in staff recommendation 3, which we'll cover in more detail. But if a rule is determined to be a type 1C rule, but it only clarifies or makes minor adjustments to an existing rule, those additional requirements do not apply. And so staff put forward staff recommendation 1 because the proposed changes to OAR 649-643-0000, which again is just the purpose rule for that rule division, are limited to technical corrections. And then staff put forward staff recommendation 2 because the proposed changes to OAR 643-0300 would establish new standards for forest practices. That is the alt vegetation rule that has those proposed provisions that we just discussed. Next slide, please. And then if staff recommendation 2 was to be adopted, meaning that OAR 649-643 is determined to be a type 1C rule that changes forest practices, staff recommendation 3 outlines the facts that must exist and standards the board must determine are met prior to adopting the proposed rule. The analysis section of the staff report includes a section on each of these required determinations with corresponding information to support the staff recommendation. Right now, we're just going to go over a high-level explanation of why we put forward staff recommendation 3. Determination A, we feel is supported by the literature review, which provide the research evidence. The degradation of resources maintained under ORS 527-710-2, which is that rulemaking authority, is likely to occur if forest practices continue under the existing rule. Determination B is supported and that the provisions proposed in the rule align with the findings of the literature review, which reflect recent studies about post-disturbance harvest impacts on RMAs and water resources in areas ecologically similar to Oregon, and that it increases tree retention requirements near streams. Determination C is supported in that the proposed rule includes a purpose statement defining the objectives of the rule and is an alternative vegetation retention prescription. This means that a landowner can choose to apply the prescription instead of the standard practice or the SFO minimum option. And the rule does not place restrictions on forest practices for those who are not applying the prescription. The proposed rule also allows landowners, when the RMA or harvest unit has stand level mortality, to harvest where they would otherwise not be able to, while setting some restrictions on that activity to protect resources. Determination D is supported by the alternatives that were considered. Those alternatives included, one would be to take no action and leave the rule as is. However, based on the literature review, the desired level of protection would not be achieved. Another option would be to repeal the existing rule rather than amending the rule. This would result in there not being an alternative vegetation prescription. This alternative is considered to be the most burdensome to landowners and timber owners, as they'd have to seek and gain approval for plans for alternative practice to modify vegetation retention requirements along streams. The increased burden could decrease the likelihood of intervention, which literature review indicated could be needed depending on the type of catastrophic event and pre-existing site condition. And then since a rule is already in place, a purely non-regulatory option was not an option. However, the proposed rule is similar in spirit, and that it's an option and does not place restrictions on forest practices for those not applying the prescription. And then we concluded that the proposed rule is the least burdensome, as it allows harvest where it would otherwise be prohibited, while also providing increased level of tree retention in comparison to the current rule. Next slide, please. And then if staff recommendation 3 was adopted, staff recommendations 4 and 5 are necessary for the next steps in the rulemaking process, which would be filing the APA notice of proposed rulemaking, which would then open a public comment period on the rules, and per the requirements in ORS 527-714, making an estimate of the economic impact of the proposed rules available to the public before that public comment period closes. And then at the conclusion of the public comment period, we would return to the board for a decision regarding adoption of proposed rules. And with that, I will turn it back over to Josh.
Thank you, Nicole. And for the record again, Josh Bernard, Forest Resources Division Chief. Chair Kelly, I'll turn it back to you and the board for the recommendations you have before you today.
All right, thank you, Josh. Thank you, Nicole. After that, is there any other questions or comments from board members? Not hearing any. I will comment that I always continue to be impressed by my fellow board members. I think a lot of it really I'm impressed by the knowledge and the time that everybody takes to take, working with this these difficult things, and I think a lot of very important points have been brought up. But as Joe says, this is certainly a situation where it's not perfect. It is a compromise. There's no doubt about it. Our question is really, is this an adequate step in the right direction? And I do see one hand up, Chandra.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I'm sorry, I'm being told I'll need to speak up. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Yes, thank you. I guess I just wanted to make a couple quick comments in appreciation of previous board members' comments as well. I also really appreciate the work of the PFA parties to continually try to find these areas of alignment on really complex natural resource challenges that will persist for some time. But that said, like my fellow board members have said, a couple of them as well, I really think some of these PFA related actions have really pushed on the agencies and the board kind of outside of comfort zones at times, kind of given these tight time constraints and the heavy workload associated with the implementation of some of these tasks, right? And we're seeing the effects of some of that today with, a truncated literature review and with some of the testimony on the challenges of getting some of the new stream layers together. And most of that is really just the function of the process, I think has been said. So I think we need to make sure that going forward, to the extent that there is some consideration of that, right, when we're able to, that we are thinking about that, like good process is important. Good process is important for this board. Like we do need to have ownership of the policy decisions that we're making, and we do need to have strong records on which to base those decisions. In this case, while I certainly think a more comprehensive literature review would have been helpful, I do think the evidence in the record is sufficient to support the degradation finding today. And I do think that the proposed rule is a step, as you say, Jim, in the right direction. And so that is encouraging. What I'd also just like to point out is there was, a lot of nuance in the literature review that was in there. I think Brenda pointed out a lot of that as well. The rule is a step in the right direction. The effectiveness of that rule is going to vary depending on site-specific conditions and a lot of other factors that we, saw in the literature review. And so I'd just like to see ODF and partners and the adaptive management program as it moves forward to be thinking about that, right? And to be thinking about how we're constantly assessing the value of the current rule or the new rule as it moves forward. I'm also seeing where those gaps exist and bringing information to the fold in the future and working with partners. It sounded like some of the partners that were reached out to on the federal side said these are great areas of research that we'd like to get involved in. And so I'd love to see some of that move forward and see ODF staff come back to us at some point saying, here's kind of the plan to assess how this is going forward. So, and thank you all for the work. And I apologize that it may have come across as criticism on the lit review. I recognize that was a really short time frame and a huge amount of work. So I want to thank the staff for that as well. Thank you.
Okay, I think we as a board want to thank everybody who has worked so hard to get us to this point. The proposed motion, I'll read it and then see if there's somebody who wants to make the motion, but this is a proposed motion that came from staff. The board moves to adopt staff recommendations 1 through 5. The board moves to direct the department to file a notice of rulemaking and post the required economic analysis to the department website. Anybody interested in making that motion?
Mr. Chair, I'll try. I move to adopt the 5 stack recommendations as presented, 1 through 5. To do the notice of rulemaking. And what was the last part of that motion, Jim?
I move to direct the department to file a notice of rulemaking and post the required economic analysis to the department website.
And do the required economic analysis as required by the department. I think I got it.
I think it was close enough. All right. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Carla Chambers has seconded. So we have a motion on the table and that has been seconded. I will restate the motion and Joe, you can correct me, but the board moves to adopt staff recommendations 1 through 5. The board moves to direct the department to file a notice of rulemaking and post the required economic analysis to the department website. We good with that?
Yes, very good.
Okay. Any further debate?
Jim, if I could,
Absolutely.
So I just want to say that in my view, the current rules are inadequate. The proposed rules are inadequate because they're not based upon the body of science that's available. And the literature review is inadequate for all the reasons that we've described. And I think it's really unfortunate, although I appreciate all the work that people did in a short time frame and the need for people to come together across the aisle to make things, move things forward. We should be able to do a better job than this.
Thank you, Brenda. And I don't see what you're saying as being difficult. I think you're making important points for the record. So appreciate that. All right. With that, I would like all of you to be unmuted and prepared to vote when I call your name. And I will start that. Liz Akpawa.
Chair Kelly, I vote yes.
Carla Chambers.
Yes.
Ben Doimling.
Yes.
Chandra Ferrari,
Yes.
Joe Justice,
Yes.
and I am a yes as well. And Brenda McComb.
No.
Okay. So Joe Justice has made this motion and it was seconded by Carla Chambers. I'm going to restate the motion one more time for the record. The board moves to adopt staff recommendations 1 through 5. The board moves to direct the department to file a notice of rulemaking and post the required economic analysis to the department website. Okay, and so that motion is passed, and with that, although we did not have consensus, the motion carries. Any closing remarks from board members? All right, with that, we can close the item and adjourn the meeting. Thank you all for being here, and I apologize for not being able to be here at the beginning of the meeting. And with that, we are adjourned.